The Spanish-American War marked the end of Spanish colonial dominance in the Americas and opened a new era for the United States. Although the direct conflict was fought between Spain and the United States, its origins lay in the struggle for independence within Cuba. The Cuban people longed to free themselves from Spanish rule, and their determination eventually drew the attention and involvement of the Americans. Cuba had attempted to break away from Spain once before during the 10 Years' War, which began in 1868. The United States refrained from becoming involved in that earlier struggle, but by the 1890s, attitudes had changed. When a second rebellion erupted in 1895, the American people and government began paying close attention. Sympathy for the Cuban cause grew, and so did American interest in the region. Newspapers carried vivid reports of Spanish atrocities, and politicians debated whether the United States should step in to help. American journalism played a central role in shaping public opinion. Papers that thrived on sensationalism, known as yellow journalism, printed exaggerated accounts of Spanish cruelty. These reports stirred anger and inflamed calls for intervention. The decisive moment came with the destruction of the American battleship, USS Maine. The ship had been sent to Havana to protect American citizens during the unrest, but on February 15, 1898, it exploded in the harbor. 260 crewmen were killed. The cause of the blast was never fully determined, but many Americans immediately blamed Spain. The cry "Remember the Maine" became a rallying call, and pressure on Congress to declare war mounted. President Grover Cleveland had initially maintained neutrality in the Cuban conflict. However, Spanish policy under General Valeriano Weyler hardened American views. Weyler had forced thousands of Cuban civilians into concentration camps where disease and starvation were rampant. The harsh tactics shocked the American public, and journalists gave Weyler the nickname the Butcher. By the time William McKinley replaced Cleveland as president in 1897, public opinion leaned strongly toward intervention. Matters escalated further when a private letter written by the Spanish Foreign Minister Enrique Dope de Lame was published. In February 1898, the letter insulted President McKinley and cast doubt on his leadership. Combined with the recent destruction of the USS Maine, outrage spread quickly across the United States. On April 25, 1898, Congress officially declared war on Spain. Even as the declaration was made, American leaders took care to state their intentions. The Teller Amendment was added to the war resolution, assuring that the United States had no desire to annex Cuba or rule it directly. Officially, the goal was simply to support Cuban independence, yet the war would have far broader consequences. Reaching across the Pacific and establishing the United States as a new global power, the first major battle of the war was not fought in the Caribbean, but in the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey had already received secret orders to strike the Spanish fleet stationed at Manila Bay. On May 1, 1898, his Asiatic squadron entered the harbor and attacked. In just a few hours, the American warships demolished much of the Spanish fleet. Dewey was so confident of his victory that he ordered a break for his men to eat breakfast before finishing off the remaining enemy ships. By the end of the day, Spain had lost control of Manila Bay. Despite this naval triumph, Dewey did not have enough troops to occupy Manila. Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo had already taken up arms against Spain and controlled much of the countryside. When additional American soldiers arrived in July, the two sides cooperated uneasily. In August, the Americans staged what became known as the Mock Battle of Manila. Spanish officials preferred to surrender to the Americans rather than to the Filipino revolutionaries. The staged skirmish allowed Spain to formally hand the city to U.S. troops while keeping the revolutionaries outside. This maneuver shifted control of the Philippines from Spain to the United States while denying Filipino fighters the independence they had sought. While events unfolded in the Pacific, the United States also launched operations in the Caribbean. In June, American and Cuban forces targeted the Spanish stronghold at Guantanamo Bay. Although heavily outnumbered, the Americans used their naval power to their advantage. Over several days of skirmishes, they cut Spanish communication lines and slowly gained control of the bay. By June 10th, Guantanamo was firmly in American hands. The most famous battle of the war occurred on July 1st at San Juan Hill near Santiago de Cuba. American forces numbering around 8,000 men advanced against Spanish defenders. The fight was intense, and casualties mounted quickly. Among the attacking troops was the volunteer cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders, led by Theodore Roosevelt. Alongside African-American units such as the 9th and 10th Cavalry, they charged up Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill under heavy fire. Their success helped secure a decisive American victory, and Roosevelt later gained national fame from the episode. 2 days later, the Spanish fleet attempted to escape Santiago Harbor, but American naval forces trapped and destroyed the ships. Without reinforcements or supplies, the city of Santiago surrendered on July 17th. Spain's last hope of holding Cuba collapsed. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898. Under the terms of the treaty, Spain relinquished control of Cuba and ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. In return, the Americans agreed to pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines, although the treaty fulfilled the U.S. pledge to grant Cuba independence. It also marked the beginning of American overseas empire. For Spain, the war was a devastating blow. Once one of the world's great colonial powers, Spain now lost nearly all of its overseas possessions. The defeat forced the country to turn inward, focusing on rebuilding its economy and society at home. The loss marked the end of centuries of Spanish dominance beyond Europe. For the United States, the consequences were dramatically different. The victory in the new territories acquired overseas transformed the nation into a global power with a presence in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. The war was short, lasting only a few months, but its effects were long-lasting. It represented the first step toward a century in which the United States would play a central role in world affairs. Not everyone in America celebrated these new developments. A movement of anti-imperialists argued that the United States had betrayed its own founding principles. They criticized the government for opposing European empires while at the same time beginning to build one of its own. Still, the majority of Americans supported the expansion, and the victories brought a sense of pride and confidence. The Spanish-American War was a turning point in history. For Spain, it was the final chapter of a colonial empire that had once stretched across the globe. For the United States, it was the beginning of a new identity as a rising power, prepared to influence events far beyond its borders. The conflict revealed the growing importance of the media in shaping public opinion, and it demonstrated the ability of the United States to project military force overseas. In the end, the war reversed the fortunes of two nations. Spain's era of expansion was halted while the United States entered a period of rapid growth and influence on the world stage. Though the war lasted only a matter of months, its impact was profound, setting the stage for the century of American power that followed.